welcome to the Mediators Coaching Club. Thank you so much for being here, to all of you. And most importantly, of course, a huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time. The panelists will be discussing, do mediators need emotional intelligence? However, before we begin, I will just do a very short introduction to the panelists so you know who's speaking today. Beginning with Tasneem Virani. Tasneem is an organizational coach, a consultant, and a mediator. Tasneem specializes in emotional intelligence, and she's actually recently written a book called Human Touch Leadership. She also runs masterclasses on building emotional and conversational intelligence for mediators. We are also joined by Mark Summerfield, who is a commercial litigation partner at a boutique firm of solicitors in London and a recommended lawyer in the Legal 500. Mark has been a commercial mediation specialist for over 18 years. Furthermore, we are joined by Chris Mills, who is in the financial services industry, who's been there for more than 30 years, and he is a mediator in commercial and sports mediation. And of course, he's also a solicitor. And last but not least, we are joined by Alnoor Maherli from New York, originally from Canada, living in New York. He used to work in the public sector. He was actually a diplomat for 9 years. And a couple of years ago, he became a certified mediator, and he's also the co-founder of Venn Mediation. So thank you so much to the panelists for being here. To the audience, if you have any questions to the panelists throughout the webinar, please feel free to just drop them in the chat, and we will do our very best to address these towards the end of the webinar. So anything that pops in your mind, just drop it in the chat. So if you're okay with it, I'm just going to dive straight in, and I'd like to ask you, Tasneem, why don't you just start us off by telling us what is emotional intelligence?
You know, there's so many definitions of emotional intelligence out there, but I'm going to give you sort of a nutshell of understanding. It is the ability to recognize and be aware of the emotions that you're feeling. Recognize when you're having these and be able to learn to navigate these in your body and mind, but also find ways to motivate yourself using different techniques. This is when you're increasing self-awareness in emotional intelligence so that it doesn't cloud your ability to think. But emotional intelligence is also about you learning social awareness. So it's about you understanding another person's thoughts and feelings and really learning to listen to the heart of the issue from their perspective. We need to understand ourselves. We need to understand why we have emotions, where they're coming from, and be more self-aware from different aspects, because our brain is full of thoughts, and these thoughts come from our personality, our past memories, our experiences, our biases, and it's almost an energy that keeps on flowing in your body. It takes work. Because as we're in conversations, people always have a different point of view and they all want to be heard. And sometimes no one really listens or acknowledges the other person. We just react. So when we have emotional intelligence and we can have those conversations and we sense there's an emotion underneath there that needs to be heard, you almost learn to pick it up. Because if you don't, have you noticed the person just gets louder and louder, and each person begins to defend their position by both feeling that they are both right. Then we convince ourselves they're right because you go into your memory of all the other experiences that prove that you're right. So think of your mind as a container of information that needs to be heard to and seen from different perspectives. So it is a skill. So emotional intelligence is a skill. It's having the ability to understand myself, know where it's coming from, what is it the bigger picture I want in mind, and where's the other person coming from? And what do I want the outcome of the situation to be? So it's having the intelligence to navigate through all this using the human mind. I hope that explains it.
Yes, thank you so much. No, that's really helpful. Mark, just taking what Tasneem has just said about, what emotional intelligence is, what would you say, how does one actually become an emotionally intelligent mediator?
I don't think it's the sort of thing that you can read a book and suddenly become, by following 10 items in a list, you become emotionally intelligent. I think it's something that's acquired over time and dealing with people. I deal a lot with litigation in a courtroom with a judge making decisions. I mean, there is no emotion in that process. And often a judge is constrained by the law and the facts. The beauty of mediation is that you can actually become a human being, and you can use your many human qualities to try and engineer and encourage people to settle. I find that with mediation, it's so important to build trust with everybody around the table, not only perhaps in a joint session, but also when you're with them in private session, and just getting in touch with what's actually at the root of the problem and of the dispute, spending some time to get to know people, and empathizing with the position they find themselves in, and just often listening. Becoming emotionally intelligent, it actually in some ways can be a passive process. You really need to understand what other people are thinking, where they're coming from, why they feel so strongly about things, which perhaps just by reading papers you can't get the story behind the headlines. So I think it's very important before a mediation to do some research on the people who are going to be there. I think these days it's not too difficult through LinkedIn or Google or any type of search engine to find out a little bit about the people that are around the table. I think you've got to dig a little bit deeper and spend some time getting to know people, even talking about things like families and background, things that are not directly related to the dispute. Part of the trust building process is to come across as a person who's interested in those litigants, in those people who are at war, and trying to get them to feel that you are somebody that can be trusted. There's a big difference between, say, a high court judge in England, who's a sort of cold, detached figure who's there just to make a decision. Mediator is very much involved in the dispute. It's not their decision, and they're not going to make any judgments. But if you can understand the emotions that are around the table and use your own experience, that's half the battle to settling, in my view.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, in what you just said, you obviously spoke quite a lot about trust. So, and obviously that is quite an important element to a mediation. How would you say, from your experience, that trust is built, and most importantly, how would you maintain it throughout a mediation?
Yeah, well, building trust is, some people say with mediation, why does it have to last 8, 9, 10 hours, which it often does? The answer is because it's not just about getting straight into the issues in the case and trying to resolve those issues. The trust building takes time, and that's through conversation, exploring people's histories, exploring the background to the break. Why did this dispute arise? And to build that trust, you need to sort of dig into the facts a little bit and push people to tell you more. There's almost like a therapist's role in there, that mediation can be the first time that somebody feels that somebody's actually listening to them. And I feel that if that takes an hour or however long it may take out of your day, that can save a huge amount of time as you sort of go down the road to settlement. So building trust, I think there's a lot of listening and a lot of empathy. And I think your second question was, how do you keep it going all day? It's not straightforward, because as a mediator, I'm often, particularly at the moment, it's all on remote Zoom and Microsoft Teams. It's quite difficult to stare at a screen for 8, 9, 10 hours and maintain your concentration. I think you need to take breaks. We're all human, and even if it means just getting some fresh air for 5 minutes, that can recharge you and help to maintain the concentration later on. In the real world, outside of the pandemic, when you're in a building with people mediating in person, again, it's the same principle of taking some breaks. Sometimes I'm in a mediation with an observer who might be helping me or assisting in some way, and it's quite good just to bounce ideas off that person, get a reality check that it's all going the right way. But I think it's very difficult if you don't take a break to just sort of go through a mediation for 8 or 9 hours and be 100% focused the whole time. I mean, it's just, human beings can't do that. So yeah, trust building is at the core of mediation, in my view. If everybody trusts you, and that's the skill of a good mediator, that you can have people who are so far apart and so many issues between them, but they can all trust you as the mediator. I think it's a real skill. It's not developed overnight, but it's like everything. The more you do, the better you get at it.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, it's funny you said, take a break, and that's something that Tasneem preaches all the time. So I can already tell she's like happy that you just said that. So Tasneem, I'm sure you want to jump in there right now, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want me to jump in, or wait? I think
Go for it. I mean, if you have something to add to what Mark
no.
said.
I think it's great because that's it. It is emotional intelligence is a skill. It does take time to develop, but if you don't take a break, how can you think straight? Because you're constantly bombarded with information, and you get your mind to pause to when you take that break and to talk, like Mark said, talk to somebody and maybe have a reality check. It's needed to go back into the same context. The mind needs a rest.
Yeah. No, thank you, Tasneem. Yeah, I thought that would be, your vital point. So Chris, obviously, you've been in the finance industry for such a long time, quite fast paced and so on, and then going into mediation. So what are some of the factors that you feel that you have that make you an emotionally intelligent mediator, given your experience?
I do think experience, not necessarily of mediation, but maybe of the work environment or life, can be quite critical. And so it's easier to give it by way of sort of examples. I mean, I must admit, in a mediation, I don't actually think about emotional intelligence. It's not a conscious thing. But I think people evaluate people. And when you meet someone for the first time, there's a whole series of evaluations that you're going through. And I certainly, having employed hundreds of people over the years, making decisions, or you evaluate something almost like in 30 seconds about, whether they fit in, whether they do this, what their personality is like, and then that just builds. So a lot of my sort of experience in mediation has come from that sort of experience. So something recently, I was mediating a dispute about a film investment. And the film investment was someone who bought loan notes in a film. The film was made, etc. Now, I also run my own pension. I use a financial advisor, but I do. So I do invest in small closed companies, illiquid, and I do buy loan notes. So I do understand the risks and the elements that are surrounding that. So when sort of mediating that type of situation, I can empathise with the parties, because I've been involved with that type of situation. I just find it quite easy to help the parties find some sort of solution in terms of moving them into an area where they can find some agreement and they can settle. And so a lot of my stuff I feel is based on sort of experience. I've been in the county court, and I've gone all the way right up into the Court of Justice of the EU. So I've been in all of those court environments, having given evidence in crime and in civil. I know what it's like to stand in a witness box and to be bombarded. Even though I've got some skill, it's easy to be tripped up. And if you've never been in court and you haven't experienced that can be quite a daunting thing, even if you're a very senior executive who thinks they've done everything and know it. Actually being in that situation can be quite difficult. So I think all those sorts of life experiences, they help me with the emotionally intelligent side of when I'm dealing with the parties and other people, about trying to assess and seeing how I can help them find some form of resolution. You can see that whether they're scared or whether they're anxious, or whether they're really concerned on risk, whether they do or they don't, where money's a big issue. And I think you can sort of evaluate as you're going through, and that just helps you. And so that's really from an, looking at emotional intelligence, it's my experiences of my working life, I think, help me to bring some value to the mediation environment.
Thank you so much, Chris. I mean, that actually leads me to Alnor, because obviously you've also been, a diplomat for quite a few years, and you weren't in mediation, until quite recently. So when you go into mediation, what do you feel are some of the biggest challenges that you face?
Yeah, no, thanks, Kim. Great question. I think one of the biggest challenges that I faced in terms of the mediations I've done is when you have two parties, they're embroiled in a dispute, and at some point, one of the parties makes a threat to leave. They just say, this is not working for me. This may be an emotional outburst. And they say, listen, I just don't want to be here anymore. And, most mediators adhere to this principle of self-determination, which means not only are the parties in charge of their own outcomes and fate, this also means they decide whether or not they even want to be a part of the mediation process at all. And, a lot of people get into mediation to support people through their conflicts, and they want to help them. And it can be a little bit jarring in an early mediation when a party's like, this isn't working, I don't want to be here, because you can start to think, was it my fault? Is it their fault? Is something happening here? So a good mediator has to determine whether or not this is a sincere threat, or could it just be posturing in terms of determining, whether or not this is one way they think they may be able to get their way. So a couple of ways that I've learned to handle that as part of kind of my emotionally intelligent approach to mediating is I like to kind of dig a little bit deeper. So, I may reflect a little bit and say, it sounds like this process may not be working for you. Can you tell me more about this and what would make it better for you? Or I like to do a bit of reality testing, and I may ask them, if that's your prerogative, mediation is a voluntary process, but what would you do if you walk away at this point? What would that look like for you? So I've kind of learned to calm that little voice down inside my head and, really try to determine a bit more where that question is coming from.
Okay, just out of curiosity, Mark earlier was saying something. Sometimes it's good to just kind of take a step back and maybe kind of think about things. Do you do that during your mediations if it gets quite like challenging in that sense, that you just kind of take a break for a minute to reset your thoughts basically?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the mediations I do are solo. Some of them are co-mediation. So there's a trick that some co-mediators like to do called the Mediator Caucus. And it's just a chance for you to check in with the other mediators, see where they're at, see if you're hearing the same thing, see whether or not you're on the same page. So that's something, sometimes before we put parties into private caucuses, there's an obvious window there to check in with yourself or with your other mediator to see how things are going. But I really echo Tasneem's comment about how breaks can be so helpful. Sometimes the parties take them themselves. And I was dealing with a mediation recently. It was a noise complaint, which are very common in New York City, obviously, probably in London too. So a lot of the mediations we handle are noise complaints between neighbors. And at one point, and these neighbors have been calling the police on each other, very heated. And another common thing about this mediation was it was the first time they were actually speaking to each other directly. In a lot of mediations, we find that when they haven't spoken to each other. There's been a lot of yelling and screaming and maybe police called in, but no direct communication. And at one point, one of the parties got so frustrated, she's just like, I just need a break. I'm gonna, I need to go to the bathroom. So we took a 5-minute bio break. We let her go to the bathroom, and this isn't that uncommon, but by the time she'd come back and collected her thoughts, she'd kind of come to realize that this dispute was really affecting her, and she didn't like that. And the dispute got resolved in the next 10 minutes. Like, even I was surprised with how effective that little pause was to just put things in perspective for her. So I definitely agree with Tasneem that these pauses or breaks can be very effective.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I'm glad, everyone's already on the same page on that. Mark, just going back to that actually. So how would you deal with your emotions during a mediation?
It's a really good question, because I've been in mediations where you read the papers beforehand, and I think in your mind sometimes, even before you start the mediation, you form a view as to who might be in the right or the wrong, or you try obviously not to show any bias at all, but inevitably you meet people who are difficult people and who may not be your cup of tea. So it's very important, I think, to try as hard as you can to treat everybody the same. Try very hard not to judge people, not to judge books by their covers, because people come into mediation for all sorts of reasons and with all sorts of history. I had a dispute recently. I mentioned this to Tasneem actually when we were in a seminar about a month ago, where it was a contractual dispute, and one of the parties had decided to terminate the contract because they found out that the managing director of the other side was a convicted paedophile. And he was at the mediation, and I have to say I found it quite challenging to sit for quite a long period of time with somebody who clearly has a sort of shady-ish past. But you have to try very hard to rise above it and to put your own emotions to one side. You know, it was an interesting legal dispute, but at the same time, in my mind, you can't help but judge people based on what you know about them. So it's very difficult. You know, I do find sometimes that I need to stand back and take a breath and try and move the mediation forward without any reference to my own personal thoughts. Just one other thing I was thinking about breaks. The one thing I try very hard not to do when I do take a break is check email, check WhatsApp messages, because you will lose your focus in 2 minutes. If, you know, we're cursed in this world with our smartphones pinging all day long. The minute you start drifting off into something else that's going on in your life, I think you lose your focus on the mediation, you lose your emotional intelligence. I hope that's perhaps a long-winded answer to your question, but I hope I covered it.
No, definitely. No. I mean, I can only imagine how difficult it can get. Chris, do you have any kind of input?
If it's possible, I do like to meet the parties beforehand, and certainly on Zoom, it tends to be easier to do that. And just, you know, being on listening and talking, and maybe talking a bit about yourself, about, you know, your background and that you're a mediator and how you're going to do, you know, how the process works and how you're going to contribute, etc. And also finding out a bit about the other party. It helps to sort of build that element of trust that Mark was talking about earlier on, and making the, you know, the party, if it's possible, to have a degree of comfort in terms of dealing with you, and appreciating the significance of the confidentiality, and that they can say exactly what they want, knowing full well that it will stay exactly where it is. So, you know, that's not always possible, but where it is, I think it can help.
Thank you. I mean, just because you also just referred to Zoom, we did actually receive a really good questions from the audience, and I'm just going to put it out there just because it's exactly in line with what you were talking about. It's from Rosamond in Kenya, and she said, does online mediation present any challenges to the mediator in exercising emotional intelligence? So, I mean, do you do things differently because it's online, or does it not really make a difference to you?
I do think the thing is, when you walk into a room, you can feel people, you can feel tension, you can feel emotion. And that's in respect of Zoom. You don't quite get it like that. And you can feel, you can watch body language, the intonation between the parties and maybe their advisors or other people, and you can sense, which is difficult to do on Zoom. And so I think that Zoom doesn't necessarily quite give you the feel that you would if you were doing face-to-face mediation.
I would agree with that. I think if you'd asked me a year ago or maybe 15 months ago whether mediation over Zoom would be effective, I would have had serious doubts. It's actually been working very well. I've been mediating over Zoom constantly. I definitely prefer face-to-face mediation. I think there's nothing quite like looking somebody in the eyes, really in the eyes, rather than just over Zoom. I think the body language, the whole atmosphere of the day is very different if you're in a sort of more formal setting than everybody just sitting in their kitchen on Zoom. But it does work, but I think you have to adapt. Personally, I think it's easier to get to know people in person.
Do you think it'd be hard to go back? Sorry, Eleanor, go please.
Just quickly to jump in, I would agree. I mean, it has been challenging, but that adaptation has been especially important. And I feel it probably takes a little bit more effort. You know, you definitely need to make sure that you're a bit more present. But you know, definitely one of the things that's been very effective for me in terms of building trust is just really kind of focusing on them. And you know, you can really watch those facial expression changes or the body language change. And I think, as you know, Mark had mentioned earlier, that people really get to trust you when they feel listened or acknowledged by you. And when you can actually kind of catch a little facial tick or a change in body language, people really do start to be like, wow, this person's really paying attention. They really get me. So, you know, I find that you definitely have to focus a little bit more on an online platform. So the two kind of tricks or adaptations that we've done is, one, we probably shorten our sessions a little bit, just because we do find the Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So that's been helpful. And then two, I think it's really important to turn off your own camera, just to make sure, I think it's been scientifically proven that human beings have a tendency to look at themselves. So if you turn off your own camera, you're more inclined to focus on your parties.
Can I add something here? So there are two ways to look at it. When you are strong with your own emotions in a situation, and you are in a room with two really heated people who have all their thoughts and emotions and opinion about the situation, and you are feeling their energy in a room, as a mediator, you've also got to be really strong to manage those emotions. Because on Zoom, you don't have to pick it all up. So sometimes you can be more objective in the way you ask the questions because it's not affecting you as much. So I just want to ask everyone, you know, because Mark, you've been doing a lot on Zoom, and Chris, have you seen that difference? That when you're physically in a room and people are getting heated up or very emotional, that you are able to manage that emotion within you the same as you would on Zoom? Or do you find sometimes it's easy on Zoom because they've also got to take a break, they've got time to regroup, and they've got to think through things because they know they're going to go on a screen? But if you're in a room face to face, everyone's picking up each other's energy, and you've got to really be skilled at separating it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, as I said before, I think the atmosphere in a personal face-to-face mediation is so different. But we're all learning to live with Zoom in every walk of life. I think naturally people are a bit more relaxed at home. It's a bit like I've been also doing court hearings online. It becomes very different when you see a judge sitting at home. You know, in England, judges wear wigs and robes, but the way it's been going on Zoom is, you know, you see judges in a very different way. They're much more human, but I don't think you create the same tension when people are on Zoom. I think my own view is you get a lot more. I mean, we had a very successful rate of settlement, but I still think it's a bit like networking. You know, I think you can do almost everything on Zoom, but it's quite difficult to network with people on Zoom. You know, you miss having when you go to a conference or something and you go for a drink with people in the break, or you have a lunch with people, you can't really recreate that. And I mean, look at us today. All you see are people's heads and shoulders. You know, it's just not the same. And for that reason, you have to adapt, but it's not easy.
Comparatively, I was going to mention about community mediation, because community mediation is just full of emotion, and there's very, very little commerciality and money involved in that. And I do sometimes think that the community side of mediation is quite difficult to mediate, because it could be warring neighbours, it could be warring communities, etc. There's a whole series of different emotions. Certainly in a face-to-face, that can be quite hostile. Yet on Zoom, in actual fact, it reduces the temperature. And in actual fact, to some extent, I think that community mediation is easier to mediate on Zoom than actually in the same room.
Yeah, that's exactly what why I wanted to see the difference, because I can see that if it's really heavy and tension in a room with because emotions emote. And when they emote, that means they're contagious. So when they're contagious, they feed into everyone. You feel the energy everywhere. And it's almost like being mindful, but at the same time, be able to separate yourself from it so that you can become neutral. And on Zoom, you can feel the emotion. I'm not saying that you can't, but you don't have the intensity of that energy on Zoom. So you can say, okay, I know everyone's upset and very angry at the moment, and you all have different mixed emotions about the situations. I'd like to do some breathing techniques, and let's take a break and let's come back in about 20 minutes. So you've also given them the space to stop, to think and go away and come back. But if you're with them, they may not do that. They'll just go on and on and on because everyone's feeding off each other's emotion, especially if it's in I can imagine in a community setting. Chris?
Yeah, no, it is. It can be incredibly hostile and quite aggressive, quite difficult to manage. You virtually got to put the parties into separate areas, and then to cool the situation down before you can bring it back and carry on. But quite unlike anything else, I think.
One of the sort of tricks of the trade, which Tasneem and I were discussing when we last met, was there's nothing quite like complimenting somebody to suddenly move things forward. People enjoy a nice comment about, in a mediation setting, it might be that, I think you're coping very well, or I think you've done an outstanding job, or something like that. It's amazing how that can turn things at the right moment. For people who are angry, to suddenly have a sort of a kind of warm feeling come over them that somebody's acknowledging their skill or their position. I do think that's something that works, whether you're in real life or whether you're in Zoom. People like to feel acknowledged.
Yeah.
We also like to do something called normalizing, where a lot of people, they can feel isolated or alone in their conflicts. So a nice reflection about how it's not uncommon to be upset about something like this, or these situations do arise. You're not the only one in these situations, but also kind of like the compliments, or like we call it stroking, where this is a difficult process, but you've made progress and you've done a really good job. I definitely echo Mark's comments on that.
I think also there's and I can appreciate on today's call, we've got a lot of people from a lot of different countries. Culturally, you also have to be very aware of the people around the table. There are different ways of talking to people, which in some countries you may find offensive. In other countries, you may find it entirely appropriate. I'm thinking of things like shouting. I've been to mediations where people shout at each other, and whilst that's not really the English way of doing things, it may well be in certain countries. I had a mediation involving Spanish, at least one Spanish party, and they couldn't believe that we weren't all shouting at each other. I think you have to be very aware that culturally and also religiously, sometimes you get disputes where people have there's a religious element to the dispute. Part of your preparation for the mediation to have a look at the cultures and the religions and all the different factors that might affect a settlement. So I think that's part of emotional intelligence, understanding where people have come from in terms of their upbringing and their values. And, you have to adapt.
Yeah.
I also do not think that loss of face can be quite significant as well. And so my comment on that in a sort of mediation stroke negotiation, some time ago, where I was involved in a significant sort of pan-European program that went dreadfully wrong. And the person that I was dealing with at the time had only recently been appointed as the CEO. And so he in actual fact had inherited the problem. And his issue really was about his board, just joining the board, and how he was going to manage the board with this quite significant issue. And you know, we were talking about significant sums of money. And I spent a lot of time doing some research on him and looking at his background. He was, I won't say which country he came from, but he was a European, to get a better understanding of how, of sort of information I think might help when sort of negotiating, mediating the situation. And we did it over a period of, it was over a month. And essentially I just used my sort of skills in terms of as a lawyer and going through the court system, and explaining to him that, you know, we could go to court, but in actual fact we'd be spending hundreds and thousands of pounds doing that, and in the end there's no certainty of outcome. You know, you're not necessarily going to win, and you just don't know. Yet if we continue a dialogue, if we keep talking, then we will find some form of settlement, and then we'll be able to resolve it. And it was as much about him not losing face with his board and agreeing something that wouldn't embarrass him more than the actual sum of money itself.
Mm.
Tasneem, just a quick question, just because it was on top of my mind when Mark, Chris, and Alnur were also speaking about reactions by participants. And obviously, I know you value the recent, neuroscience research and so on. So, do you have something to add from that perspective in terms of how people react?
Okay, so think of your brain as an organ, all right? And your brain has many, many parts in it. So within the human brain, the different parts, you have reptilian side of it, you have the limbic or the animal side, but you also have parts of the brain that are totally unique to human beings, that help you to intellectualize, be creative, come up with solutions. Now, if the human mind is having to work together, it's working together through transmitters and also pathways. It's like a network. So if a word or an emotion or the way things are said or a conversation or a feeling and triggers that response, you're going to be much more animal because you're going to go and defend your position. So when you're much more animal, you automatically release cortisol because you're defending yourself. And cortisol, what it does, it's a chemical or a neurotransmitter, to call it, that actually says, shut down, pathway closed, no, nothing can move. So just think of it like that, nothing can move. So you're not going to think straight, but what you're going to do is you're going to go into past memory. So you're going to go and look at evidence why this person has been awful or why you believe that. So you're going to push to try and prove that you're right. Because the chemical has stopped you from thinking straight. This is why I say it's important to take a break and deep breathing. Because if you breathe deeply, you actually open the transmitters by producing gamma butyric acid and the pathways open again. But the key thing, and I'm so glad Mark brought it up about gratitude. We have, and using different language, because we now know that when you release more oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin, these are released through forgiveness, through language that includes bonding or opens the mind up so that you can use the capacity of the human brain. And I talk a lot about this in my book, The Human Touch Leadership. to sort of bring all this together, even in the state of conflict. Because when you immediately are protecting yourself, you go into your past trauma. So, when a deadlock situation happens, the mediator may have said something that breaks the trust. Just a question. Well, you're in a very difficult situation. You've got to make a decision now. Just by saying it that way in a language that's hard will cause them to defend themselves. Instead, you could say, I know you really want to settle. And at the heart of this issue, you really had great experience working with these people before. And you have a lot of great skills in you that and thoughts that you've already discussed with me that could help move this forward. What are some of the options that you could consider that would help both of you at this time? Now, that is using emotional intelligence and conversational intelligence, because that's going to release those chemicals that I'm talking about in neuroscience. But another important fact is we've got to keep our brains healthy, because if you're constantly stressed, you're running from one mediation to another. I'm a promoter of mindfulness, of taking times to break, and mindfulness also in listening to the heart of the conversation. Like, keep your filters. Being mindful is being in the present moment. So even in a mediation, you're in the present moment. So you keep your mind straight, but also keeping your mind healthy. Because if you're not healthy in your mind and you're constantly stressed, how much cortisol have you produced? So is your mind going to be able to think straight? Yes, you will definitely react. I see it every day now during the pandemic, where people are reacting very quickly to situations because they have so many mixed emotions, and they're not unpacking those emotions. I hope that and that leads to building trust, because the brain, I have this diagram where I use is that the way we use language and the way we listen and we acknowledge feelings. So when people are resistant, how do you use language and acknowledgement of where they're at to move them along so that they can become collaborators or co-creators of solutions? You've got to increase more oxytocin in their brain, or appreciation statements, or encourage them to use forgiveness.
Thank you, Tasneem. So much to think about. So I actually just have one final question for all of you, and then the audience has a few questions for you, which I'll pose to you. This is more of a question for us young mediators. So it's to all of you. What would you say are things that we can do? I know, Mark, you said there isn't a checklist to just be an emotionally intelligent mediator, and obviously it requires experience, but what is something that we can do to kind of build on that, learn? I mean, obviously there's Tasneem's course, there's books, but what can we really do? Any suggestions?
I think I would work on your listening skills. I think to me, people like to unload, and often mediation is the first time that they get to unload. So yeah, that was my sort of top tip. I think listen and don't interrupt. It's very easy. Lawyers like me, and I think Chris as well, we're trained to give advice, to ask questions, and to possibly, sometimes the best thing in mediation is not to say too much, listen. So that would be my tip.
Chris, Alnor, Tasneem, any tips?
I think it's just one thing I want to add is that we're talking about mediators today in a mediation process where everyone needs a mediator. People find it hard to deal with conflict or matters. They don't want to go and talk about it. And mediation is so important. And, mediators, not just only in the sort of legal setting, but mediators everywhere in any situation, because you're that neutral person who's letting all these people bombard all their information and another person, and you're trying to make sense of the conversation and helping them to make sense of hearing things differently. Because when people are in a dispute, they're full of their own thoughts and emotions, and they always think they're right. But the mediator role is so important, and I think it's going to grow because in different ways, even parents end up being mediators and learning to be neutral and having to learn how to be neutral between two siblings because everyone says you think you're taking their sides. So it's a valuable skill, whether you practice mediation or not, or you want to learn mediation, I'd really encourage it as a life skill, using emotional intelligence, of course.
I think patience is really important as well. I mean,
yes.
Because, often people ask me, let's say you're dealing with a financial dispute and somebody owes somebody $1 million and inevitably they're never going to pay $1 million, but you might end up with a settlement somewhere in the middle of the two positions that people start at. People say, well, why do you need to sort of spend 8 or 9 hours mediating to get to that point? Why can't, if everybody thinks you're just going to end up at halfway between the two positions, or why don't you go straight there at 10 o'clock in the morning? The answer is it's not that easy. People need to be brought to the table. It's a very carefully thought out, very patient process of moving people. In England, and I appreciate not everybody's in the same jurisdiction, but in England, a lot of people are mediating against their will. Although it is an optional process, the courts look very dimly on people who don't mediate. So you've got lawyers telling their clients to come and mediate. So I've had mediations where, you spend the first hour or two just explaining to a party why this is a good thing, because they're not convinced it is. So, just to make a little bit of progress, you need patience. And that's why in most mediations, the real action happens after about 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
The two main pieces of advice that I give new mediators is one, to really focus on being as present as possible. And, it kind of goes without saying, but in the sense that, especially in a multi-party session or a multi-hour session, you really want to be cognizant of changes in body language and tone and demeanor. Are they speaking more? Are they speaking less? If you're present enough to catch these things and then explore a little bit, that's often where really good discoveries can happen. And then the second thing I'll tell new mediators is to really just be brave, in the sense that, trust yourself, trust the process, trust your skills. I've never done a mediation where I said something so terrible that the person just stormed out of the room. More likely than not, they may correct you, which is fine, because in correcting you, that's information as well. And then from there, you can kind of pivot and then take the mediation where they need to go. So be brave and be present are the two things that I would say.
Thank you so much. Chris, yeah?
Sometimes it's easy to talk to people you don't know, because you don't have the same possibly embarrassment about telling someone that you know about situations, whatever that might be. So, talking to someone who you don't know, sometimes the conversation flows differently. You could say things you wouldn't ordinarily say. And so I think that sometimes can be, a contributing factor for the mediator to explore and to better understand the party, etc. And from sort of emotional intelligence perspective, I would say, at the very beginning, I went initially to one of, I think it was Stephen Nuttall's sessions a long, long time ago in Wandsworth, which I found quite interesting. And I subsequently after that, I also joined a community mediation business, which I'm still there. I sit on the board these days. And the one thing I think that did do at the very early stages, it was very good with helping on emotion and understanding and developing. Because as I said earlier on, I just think community mediation is just full of emotion, and it can be a good grounding to help and to move you forward in just trying to deal with those quite difficult situations.
Thank you very much. Mark, just a quick one, because before you said in England, many people don't actually want to be in the mediations. And we received one question from the audience, which I think might be suitable in this case. He said, why do mediators seem to prefer in-person mediations and clients seem to prefer online mediations? So just to kind of pick up on that. Do you have a view on that?
I think clients feel more comfortable just being at home or being in an office that in their comfort zone. I think once you're at an in-person mediation, which in my experience in London is often in some swanky lawyer's office, you suddenly feel like you're out of your comfort zone. So I can understand people feeling reassured by sitting in their own room with their own pictures on the walls and things. I think the reason mediators, or certainly I, prefer face-to-face is because I just don't feel that you can recreate the human relationship over a virtual platform. We're doing our very best with Zoom, and I think it's fine. It's absolutely fine. But as we come out of the pandemic, hopefully in the next few months, I will be pushing for my mediations to be in real life. The beauty of remote mediation is that you can be anywhere in the world, which you know, I can see that if I was a client in India, I may not want to fly into London just for a day's mediation. So I can see, if people say to me, does remote mediation work? I would say, absolutely it does, and let's give it a go. If people say to me, would you prefer us to come in person? I would always say yes, because I think you get a lot more out of the situation. But mediation over Zoom has proved to be, you know, beyond my expectations, very successful. But I understand why clients prefer it. You know, they can go, the mediator doesn't get a break. You know, the mediator's all day long going between the two or three parties. If you're at home, you'll get breaks while the mediator is with the other people, and you can take your dog for a walk or whatever you want to do. And it's just so much more real. You know, you don't feel like you're being interrogated in front of a judge or anything like that. So I understand the difference.
Mark,
Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, Mark, do you not think the commerciality of the benefits of Zoom? Do you think that, you know, it's got a degree of movement? Do you think it's likely to carry on? Because you know, certainly if you're talking about, you know, business people moving about to you know, just to click into your screen and to participate, it's much easier than getting on a plane or going somewhere and taking all your lawyers with you and all the costs related to that. Do you not think that you know, that Zoom might, you know, be more mainstream than it ever was?
Yeah, I think remote mediation is here to stay. I think there'll be a lot more, particularly lower value disputes, where it doesn't justify people traveling and taking days out. So yeah, I think it is. I just feel that, you know, an in-person mediation is my own personal preference.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think I just want to throw one question. In the last 18 months, a lot of new people who become mediators are only learnt it through Zoom. And they are doing mediations only through Zoom. So that the thing to see is, how will it work for them when they move to the live? I do believe we have a hybrid model in everything now. The world has changed, and we're going to have a hybrid model, a lot of things. But it's just curious that how they're used to doing it on Zoom and how it would be in person. Just
I think one of my worries is when we go back to the real world, and I'm as desperate as anybody to go back to the real world, but it's what I was saying before about distraction. If everybody's sitting in a office block somewhere in London or whatever city you happen to be in, you're focused on the mediation. That is what you're there for. If we're all sitting in our homes and offices on Zoom, when you get your inevitable breaks between sessions, people are going to start looking at their email. They're going to start reading other stuff.
Yeah, it's not healthy.
They're going to get WhatsApps from their children. They're going to, whatever they're going to do, they're going to take their focus away from the mediation, in my view. You can't expect people in between, when the mediator is spending 45 minutes with another party, you can't expect the other people to just sit in a vacuum doing nothing.
I just saw in the chat, there's one question, and I'm just wondering whether we can address it. It's, how does a mediator best deal with his or her own anger? So It's a very good question, because if you go into a mediation feeling angry, or you're being triggered by words and feelings of the others to feel angry, it's a time to regroup, because that person, whether you're on Zoom or not, you will be protecting yourself. So my tip here would be, and I don't know if anyone else has got a tip, would be acknowledge your emotion. Give yourself some self-compassion. Take a break at that time and say, oh gosh, I'm really angry at this situation. And then, that 6-second pause, we call it the 6-second switch of changing an emotion and a thought. What is it that's making me really angry, and how can I go into it with a much more open mind? But if you let the anger filter, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That's what emotions are. That's why emotional literacy is so important. We almost have to speak to that data. And also check yourself that, what is building up the anger. Are you stressed? Are you tired? Why are you getting triggered so quickly? I don't know if that helps or answers the question.
I've never experienced anger.
Yeah, I just had well.
I think when you answered, I just thought back how many times I've been sort of really angry, and it's not an emotion that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think this one was mainly, you get angry at this obstructive lawyer who comes in. So it's obviously some thoughts and emotions about that person.
Yeah, I recognize the idea that somebody in the room or in one of the rooms might cause you to get angry. It often is the lawyers, actually, and I'm constantly amazed that sometimes the advice I see a client being given is so poor and so just not commercial. But then you have to recognize, and I think Chris is basically saying that it's not your dispute. You shouldn't be getting angry because in the nicest possible way, you don't sort of really care about the outcome.
Yeah.
So if you're starting to care about the outcome, then you are no longer the neutral mediator that you should be. So if you're getting angry, I can only assume it's a personal, perhaps just not getting on with somebody, and that could well be the lawyer. I mean, I can understand getting angry if you keep going into the room with one party and you're just going around in circles, and it's somebody's actually not listening, or somebody's got a particular view on, I don't know, maybe gender. You do get disputes where you might be a dispute over equal pay, and somebody has a particularly offensive view about the role of women or something. I think you've got to respect people's views, even if you don't agree with them. If they make you angry, they make you angry, but you certainly shouldn't be showing it.
Quick question on that note, from the chat. I mean, I'm conscious of time. We have hit the time, so we'll be quick. But one of the questions, speaking of anger, is what do you do if the parties show, heated emotions, anger, and they kind of completely derail? How do you get them back on track?
I sometimes like the parties to show anger, actually. I think you can move a dispute very much, you can move it forward. If a party is shouting and screaming for a few minutes, that can have an amazing effect on the mediation day. If it's becoming destructive and it's going against what you're trying to achieve, then you need to take some time out. Either everybody takes time out or that particular party does. If you're in the same building, then literally a walk is a good idea. Outside, get some fresh air. But I think sometimes you have to recognize that anger can be helpful. If another party sees how important something is and how emotional it's making the other person, that can be very effective at moving the negotiations forward. But I very rarely do I think there's any point in people shouting and swearing at each other. That to me is just playground stuff. But real emotion, real anger because of the way someone's been treated, that can be very effective if you control the way it's released. But if I feel that it's heading towards one party walking out, you've really got to manage it very carefully, and usually breaks help.
I think if it's in a sort of like a private session, let the anger play out, and you explore the anger. And I think because if someone's showing anger, I think that, a good way is to let it go. It's almost like have your time, say what you want, whatever it is, and then you sort of move the discussion on from there.
I think it's all about carefully managing it, like Mark and Chris saying. You get the temperature, you know what the meat of the conversation is in the anger, and some people can only express things in that way. And then you get them maybe to take a break and reflect on that meat of that situation, and then bring them back together. But just watch how the brain is reacting to stop and then hear.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. There are a few more questions, but I don't think we have time for them anymore. But I think most of them have been covered in terms of, what's most important and for emotional intelligence. I'm sure we could continue for like 2 hours. So thank you so much for all of you. And thank you to the audience for being here. Of course, if you have, urgent pressing questions, email them to us and then we'll forward them to the panelists. Again, thank you so much, and hopefully see you at our next coaching club in a couple of months.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.